He rode into town with dust on his coat and a dying baby in his arms. No money, no friends, just regret thick as the dirt on his boots. When Jesse McCall asked for milk, they laughed, called him a coward, turned their backs, but one woman didn't. Clara Whitlow crossed that saloon floor with flour on her hands and defiance in her step, and gave him the one thing Redemption Hollow had long forgotten: mercy. If you believe every man deserves one last chance to do right, stay with us. The baby wouldn't stop crying. The wind howled across the barren trail like a wounded coyote, dragging dust in long, bitter ribbons that stung Jesse McCall's eyes. His hat sat low, brim torn and stained, but it did little against the grit working its way into every crack of his weathered face. With one arm, he held the reins loose, trusting the horse more than he trusted himself to stay upright. With the other, he cradled the small bundle against his chest, a feverish, starving infant, limp but still fighting for breath. Redemption Hollow came into view just as the sun bled out behind the hills. The town sat half-sunken in its own shadows, a scattering of wood and rust clinging to the edge of survival. Broken fences, tilted porches, windows that stared like blind eyes. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, curling thin as if the place itself feared drawing too much attention. Jesse rode straight down the main street, dust rising behind him like the tail of some ghost he couldn't outrun. Faces appeared behind curtains. A boy paused by the well, bucket forgotten in his hands, staring open-mouthed. Two dogs barked from opposite ends of the street, then fell silent as he passed. He dismounted in front of the saloon, more reflex than choice. His knees buckled as his boots hit the ground, legs stiff from too many hours in the saddle. He tightened his grip on the infant as the baby's cry rose again, thin and cracked like old kindling trying to catch fire. Inside, the saloon doors swung open with a lazy creak. Laughter spilled out, thick with whiskey and dust. Men crowded around card tables, their voices loud and unbothered by the heat or the hour. Jesse stepped inside, every eye turning toward him at once. Sweat clung to his neck. The baby let out another raw wail. "I need milk," Jesse said, voice rough as gravel. The room froze for half a beat before someone snorted. "Well, look at that," a rancher at the far table drawled, pushing back his chair with the kind of slow malice only practiced men knew. McCall finally crawled back to town. "Didn't think you had the guts." More laughter followed. Jesse ignored them, moving to the bar. The barkeep, an older man with clouded eyes and shaking hands, just shook his head and pointed toward the door. "No charity here," the barkeep said flatly. "Not for your kind." The words settled like ash. Jesse swallowed hard, lips dry, throat tighter than he could bear. He shifted Luke higher against his chest, felt the baby's heat burning through the blanket, too hot, too fast. He turned to leave, legs unsteady, the weight of his mistakes pressing heavy with each step. Then, soft footsteps on wood. "Wait." The voice was low but steady. Jesse turned. At the far end of the room stood a woman in a faded blue dress, apron tied at her waist, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her hands were still dusted with flour, brown hair pinned back in a way that spoke of practicality, not vanity. Lines of worry shaped her mouth, but her eyes held something else, recognition and mercy. "I've got milk," Clara Whitlow said. Jesse didn't speak. Couldn't. For a long, breathless second, he just stood there, shoulders locked, as if any movement might shatter the thin thread holding him upright. The baby whimpered again, smaller now, weaker. That sound did what no insult or bullet ever had. It bent him, broke him just enough. Clara set down her dish towel, crossed the saloon floor without hesitation, and took the lead. "Follow me," she said, not waiting for his answer. Out on the street, the air felt cooler but no less heavy. Jesse trailed after her like a shadow too stubborn to vanish. She moved with purpose, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. They passed the boarded-up schoolhouse, the lopsided mercantile, the crooked church steeple that pointed more toward regret than redemption. Redemption Hollow wasn't a place for second chances. It barely had enough room for firsts. Clara's home sat at the far end of town, modest, square, and edged with a small patch of stubborn wildflowers that hadn't yet learned to die. The barn behind it leaned westward like it had grown tired of standing straight. She pushed open the door with her shoulder, leading him inside. The scent hit first, hay, earth, and something faintly sweet beneath it all. Chickens rustled in a nearby coop. A cat lifted its head from a beam overhead but didn't bother to move. Jesse stood awkwardly in the open space, blinking against the dim light. His whole body ached. Not from the ride, but from the years he'd spent outrunning places like this. Kindness like this. Clara grabbed a small tin pail and disappeared into the shadows at the back, where an old milk goat waited with the patience of something that had seen more winters than it cared to count. In less time than he expected, she returned with warm milk, poured it carefully into a chipped bottle fitted with a crude cloth nipple. "Sit," she said, nodding toward a hay bale near the stall. Jesse obeyed without thinking. His arms shook as he shifted the baby into a feeding position. The first drops of milk touched the boy's lips, and for a moment, Jesse thought it was too late. Then, soft, suckling, slow, desperate, life-clinging. Something unspooled in Jesse's chest, tangled and aching. Clara watched without speaking. Arms crossed, weight shifted to one hip. Her gaze was steady but not unkind. She didn't ask who Jesse was, or why he looked like a man carrying ghosts in every pocket. After a while, she crouched near the fire pit in the center of the barn and began stacking wood for a small flame. "I'll fetch blankets," she said over her shoulder. "That little one's burning up, needs cool cloths and rest." Jesse swallowed hard. "Thank you," he rasped, the words foreign in his mouth. Clara paused just long enough to glance back at him. "Don't thank me," she said quietly. "Not yet." Then she disappeared into the house, leaving Jesse alone with the crackling kindling, the smell of hay, and the first fragile sound of his boy breathing easier. Night settled slow over Redemption Hollow, wrapping the barn in velvet dark and the kind of silence that pressed heavy on the ribs. Jesse sat where she'd left him, hunched forward, elbows on his knees. The baby curled in the hollow of his arms. Luke's fever still burned, but the boy's breath came steadier now. Shallow but there, proof of something still fighting inside him. Jesse barely noticed the cold seeping up from the dirt floor, or the way his back ached from hours in one spot. His world had shrunk to the weight of a child, and the rise and fall of each small, stubborn breath. Footsteps returned. Clara appeared in the doorway, arms full of blankets, a basin balanced against her hip. Candlelight from the house caught the edges of her face. Sharp cheekbones, tired eyes, lips set in a line that spoke more of determination than kindness. Without a word, she knelt beside him and set to work. Cool cloth against Luke's forehead, fingers checking for pulse and color, movements practiced and sure, like she'd done this before. Too many times, maybe. Jesse studied her in the flickering light, watching the way her hands moved with both care and distance. She kept her heart guarded, he could see that. Built walls high and wide like a woman who'd learned what it cost to let them down. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire in the corner crackled low, casting long, restless shadows against the barn walls. Somewhere outside, a coyote yipped, the sound distant but sharp. Finally, Clara sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on the apron tied at her waist. "He's fighting," she said softly, "but he's not out of the woods." Jesse nodded, throat tight. "How long's he been sick?" she asked. "Since yesterday," Jesse said, voice low, almost ashamed. "Had nothing for him but creek water and hope. Both ran out hours ago." Clara didn't flinch at the confession. She just pulled the blanket tighter around Luke and stood. "I've got willow bark for the fever," she said. "And broth warming in the house. You'll need to eat too. You look half a breath from falling over." Jesse shook his head. "I'm fine." "You're not." Her tone left no room for argument, but she didn't push further. Instead, she crossed to the barn door and leaned against the frame, staring out into the night like she was listening for something only she could hear. Jesse followed her gaze. The town lay still under a sheet of starlight, roofs silvered, the dirt street pale and empty. But shadows lingered at the edges, places where judgment slept with one eye open. Redemption Hollow hadn't changed, and neither had its memory. As Clara turned back toward him, Jesse saw the flicker of something deep in her eyes. Not pity, not fear, recognition. Like she knew what it felt like to carry grief like a second skin. Like she'd been waiting for someone just as broken to stumble into her life. The next morning broke slow and gray, with clouds hanging low like unspoken warnings. Jesse stirred before the first crack of daylight, body stiff from sleeping upright against the barn wall. His coat, dust-caked and torn, barely kept the cold at bay. The baby lay swaddled and still, cheeks flushed but breathing softer now. The fever hadn't broken, but something in the boy's color looked less dire. Jesse sat there for a moment, staring at the dirt floor, listening to the faint rustle of chickens outside and the far-off clink of a pail. Clara was already awake. He found her near the pump, sleeves rolled to her elbows again, drawing water with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything. Her hair had come loose overnight, falling in soft, tired waves around her face. There was something unshakable about her, like a tree that had bent through too many storms but never cracked. Jesse hovered near the doorway, unsure whether to speak or disappear back into the barn. "You're up," she said without looking at him. He nodded. "Didn't sleep much." "I didn't expect you would." Her voice was even but not cold. Clara filled 2 tin cups, handing him one without ceremony. The water tasted like iron and earth, but Jesse drank it like it was holy. "His fever's holding," he said after a while. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "I'll make more broth. He'll need it." They stood in the quiet for a beat too long. Words piled up in Jesse's throat. Explanations, apologies, warnings, but none of them seemed worth saying. Finally, she broke the silence. "You gonna tell me his name?" Jesse looked down at the baby, then back at her. "Luke." Clara's mouth twitched at the corner, almost a smile. "Good name." The air between them shifted. Not softer, but less brittle. They spent the morning in small, necessary movements. Clara prepared willow bark tea and cool compresses, while Jesse fetched wood and tried to mend the barn door that hung crooked on its hinges. Neither spoke much, but the silence didn't grate like it had the night before. It settled around them like an uneasy truce. By midday, Jesse caught her watching him, when she thought he wasn't looking. She noticed the way he checked the horizon every few minutes, the way his hand hovered near the butt of his revolver, even when he reached for the ladle, the way his eyes, dark and restless, tracked every shifting shadow like a man who'd learned to expect bad news riding fast. "Who's after you?" she asked finally, setting a bowl of broth beside him without preamble. Jesse froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. "Old mistakes," he said after a long pause. "Ones that don't stay buried." Clara didn't press further. She simply nodded, like she understood more than she let on. In Redemption Hollow, mistakes had long shadows, and Jesse McCall's shadow was just starting to catch up. By the 3rd day, word had spread. It started with glances, sideways, lingering, full of something between suspicion and satisfaction. Townsfolk passed Clara's house slower than usual, their conversations lowering to murmurs when Jesse stepped outside. Children whispered near the well. The blacksmith, a man with arms like railroad ties, stared too long whenever Jesse crossed the street for supplies. Redemption Hollow wasn't big, but its memory was wide and unforgiving. Jesse kept to the barn mostly, tending to Luke, chopping firewood, fixing the sagging fence where he could. Each swing of the axe sent dull aches through his shoulders, but he welcomed the burn. Physical hurt was easier than the kind that lived behind the ribs. Clara moved through her days as she always had, head high, hands steady. But Jesse noticed the extra locks she slid across her door each night, the way she checked the curtains before lighting her lamp, the quiet way she kept a shotgun propped near the kitchen table. Then, just after sunset, trouble arrived on horseback. Jesse heard it first, the slow, deliberate hoofbeats moving down the main road. A rhythm too steady to be casual, too measured to be friendly. He stepped outside, Luke asleep in the barn, as the rider came into view. Silas Grant. Even at a distance, Jesse knew him. The set of his shoulders, the crooked tilt of his hat, the black duster that hung from him like spilled ink. Silas hadn't changed much. Still all sharp smiles and sharper motives. Jesse stayed still as the man dismounted in front of the saloon. Silas stretched like a cat waking from a nap, then turned, locking eyes with him across the street. The grin that followed made Jesse's stomach tighten. Within the hour, a paper went up on the saloon wall. A bounty. Jesse's name in ink, clear and damning. Dead or alive. The price high enough to make even poor men reconsider their morals. By morning, the whispers turned mean. Doors that had opened for Clara now stayed half-closed. The woman at the mercantile refused to sell her flour, mumbling something about sheltering outlaws. A rock appeared in Clara's front yard with one word scrawled in black tar across its face. Leave. Jesse offered to go. I've brought enough weight down on you, he said, standing at her doorstep with dust on his boots and defeat in his voice. But Clara crossed her arms, planting herself like a tree that wouldn't be moved. That boy needs food. You need sleep. And I've buried too many regrets to start adding new ones. Her voice didn't shake. Jesse opened his mouth to argue, but then caught sight of Luke stirring in the barn window, one tiny fist reaching toward morning light. For the first time in months, Jesse stayed, and for the first time since the fire that had nearly cost him everything, he decided to stop running. Days turned heavier. Jesse woke each morning with one ear tuned to hoofbeats, one hand resting near the colt at his side. Nights stretched long, filled with restless pacing and the soft creak of floorboards under his boots. Clara said little, but Jesse saw the tension in her shoulders when she moved through the house, lighting lamps slower than before, keeping her curtains drawn tighter. Luke's fever finally broke on the 6th day. The boy's color returned faintly, skin less pale, his cries stronger now, hungry, demanding, alive. Jesse cradled him in the mornings, feeding him drop by drop, and when exhaustion pulled him under, Jesse sat by the cradle, just watching. The weight of fatherhood settled over him like a coat too big for his frame, stitched with both fear and something too fragile to name. Meanwhile, Redemption Hollow darkened. The general store burned on a cold Thursday night. Smoke curled against the dawn sky like a warning. No one saw who lit the match, but everyone had opinions on where blame belonged. Should have never let him stay, one man muttered near the well. He's cursed, said another. Nothing good follows a McCall. Jesse heard every word. Clara stood firmer. When the marshal from Laramie arrived 2 days later, riding hard with dust on his coat and a telegram in his pocket, she opened the door without hesitation. Jesse watched from the corner as the marshal stepped inside, hat in hand, face lined with too many years of chasing too many men. I heard about Silas Grant, the marshal said, voice low and matter-of-fact. Jesse stayed silent. Town says you pulled the trigger. Jesse nodded once. I did. The marshal exhaled slow, like a man dragging out the pause before bad news. You know there's still warrants with your name on them. Old ones. From Cheyenne, from before the fire. Jesse's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. I ain't running, he said. Clara stood behind him then, arms crossed, gaze unflinching. He's not leaving this house, she said. The marshal studied them both, eyes narrowing, weighing something heavier than just the law. Don't make me drag you out, he said finally. You've got a kid now. Think real hard on what you want that boy to remember about you. Jesse's stomach nodded. The marshal left with no promises and no handcuffs, for now. But the threat lingered. Later that night, Jesse stood on the back porch staring out across the dark fields where frost gathered on the grass like silver dust. Luke slept inside. Clara sat by the fire, mending a torn shirt with small, precise stitches. Jesse leaned against the doorframe, breathing deep, feeling both hunted and alive in a way he hadn't in years. Maybe it was the baby's steady breaths. Maybe it was the crackle of Clara's fire. Maybe it was something else entirely. But for the first time since Redemption Hollow had buried him in rumors and regret, Jesse McCall felt the flicker of something like resolve. The first snow came early that year. Thin at first, a dusting across the rooftops, clinging to wagon wheels and fence rails like forgotten lace. But by morning, the ground lay covered in pale hush, muffling footsteps and swallowing sound. Redemption Hollow woke slower beneath the weight of it, as though the town itself held its breath. Jesse stood at the barn door, staring out at the blanket of white. Luke, bundled tight in Clara's quilt, slept against his chest. The boy's fever was gone, but Jesse still checked his breathing more times than he'd admit. Behind him, Clara moved about the kitchen, stirring something warm on the stove. The smell of oats and cinnamon drifted through the air, small comforts in a place with too few of them. Jesse glanced toward town. Smoke rose steady from chimneys. The saloon doors swung open and shut with the lazy rhythm of morning drunks and gossipers, but beneath it all, something ugly still simmered. 2 days ago, Jesse had found fresh boot tracks near the barn. Too many, too close. The night after that, someone left a dead crow nailed to Clara's fence post. A message, plain as gunmetal. Stay or go, blood would follow. Clara didn't flinch when he told her. She didn't weep or shake or suggest packing bags. She simply said, "We're not hiding," and went back to peeling potatoes like the world hadn't shifted under their feet. Jesse wasn't sure whether to admire her or fear for her. Maybe both. That afternoon, with the snow still falling soft and slow, he took Luke inside and laid him in the cradle Clara had dragged down from the attic. Then he grabbed his rifle and set about checking the property. Perimeter tight, sights clean, rounds counted twice. The past had come calling. And Jesse McCall didn't intend to meet it empty-handed. At sundown, the knock came. Hard. Flat. No courtesy in it. Jesse opened the door to find 3 men standing on the porch, local ranch hands, but their eyes told the story. They weren't here for talk. "Town wants you gone by morning," the tallest one said, shifting his weight like he was ready for a fight. Jesse met his stare without blinking. Not leaving. A beat of silence stretched thin between them. The second man spat into the snow. "Don't say we didn't warn you." They turned and walked back toward the street, boots crunching in rhythm, voices low but heated. Jesse closed the door slow, sliding the bolt across with a final, deliberate click. Behind him, Clara stood by the hearth, holding Luke close, her face pale but steady. "I'm not scared," she said softly, like a vow spoken to herself as much as to him. Jesse nodded, throat tight. "Neither am I." And for the first time, it wasn't a lie. That night, the air thickened with the kind of cold that settles deep in the lungs, making every breath feel like swallowing glass. Jesse sat near the window, rifle across his lap, eyes never leaving the dark stretch of road leading from town. The fire burned low behind him, casting long, restless shadows against the walls. Clara moved quietly around the room, checking the locks, placing a kettle on to boil, wrapping Luke tighter against the chill. Neither of them spoke much. Words felt too thin for nights like this. Outside, somewhere near the edge of the trees, a branch cracked under the weight of something, or someone. Jesse's spine straightened. His grip on the rifle tightened until his knuckles paled. Clara crossed to the cradle, laying Luke down with the tenderness of a woman who had learned how fleeting life could be. Then she walked over and crouched near the fire, loading another log, feeding the flame like it was the only living thing she trusted to stay. "I buried a child once," she said suddenly, her voice low and even, as though talking to the fire itself. Jesse turned, surprised by the break in her silence. "Little girl, name was Ruth." Her hands stilled over the kindling. Fever took her, just like that. She snapped her fingers, the sound sharp in the still room. One day she was laughing. Next, she was gone. Jesse swallowed, unsure how to answer. The ache in her voice dug deeper than pity could reach. "After that," Clara continued, "I stopped setting extra places at the table. Stopped letting folks stay too long in my life." She straightened, wiping her hands on her skirt. Didn't want to risk losing anything again. Jesse opened his mouth, then closed it, because he understood. More than he wanted to. They both stood there a moment. 2 people bound by grief they never asked for. 2 survivors too tired to run, but too stubborn to fall. Then, movement. Fast. Sharp. The back door rattled against its hinges. A shadow crossed the window pane. Jesse moved instinctively, rifle up, boots crunching across the floorboards. He pressed against the wall near the door, breath shallow, heart beating hard enough to drown out thought. Clara grabbed the shotgun from beside the table, checking the chamber with the steady hands of someone who knew exactly what fear tasted like, but refused to let it dictate her next move. The door swung open. A figure burst inside, face masked, gun raised. Jesse fired first. The shot cracked like thunder, close and final. The intruder hit the floor before his own trigger finger could tighten. Silence fell thick after that, smoke curling in the air, the sharp scent of gunpowder mixing with firewood and fear. Clara didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She only lowered the shotgun, walked over, and locked the door again with slow, deliberate hands. Then she turned to Jesse and said, in a voice low and steady, "We're not done." And Jesse knew she was right. Morning arrived reluctant and gray, spilling light across a blood-stained floor. Jesse sat at the kitchen table, shoulders hunched, staring down at his shaking hands. The adrenaline had worn off hours ago, leaving behind the old, familiar exhaustion, like he'd been hollowed out and left standing anyway. Clara moved quietly around him, pouring water from the kettle. tearing strips of cloth for bandages, though neither of them was wounded. The ritual of care was something she clung to, something that kept her from unraveling. Outside, the town stirred. Word of the night's gunfire had traveled fast. By midday, the marshal would be back, maybe with deputies, maybe with more than that. Jesse rubbed a hand across his face, feeling every mile, every sleepless night, every year of running catch up to him in one slow breath. Luke stirred in the cradle, letting out a soft, contented sigh. And just like that, Jesse found his center again. "Marshall's gonna want answers," Clara said, breaking the silence as she sat across from him. "I've run out of lies," Jesse answered. Her eyes softened. Just a little. "Good. About time." Jesse let out something close to a laugh, more air than sound, but still, something. He spent the next hour cleaning his rifle, wiping down each piece with methodical care. Clara worked beside him, boiling water, scrubbing the blood from the floor as though it were any other morning chore. The two of them moved like parts of the same broken clock, ticking forward whether they wanted to or not. When hoofbeats sounded up the road near midday, Jesse stepped onto the porch, rifle slung low but ready. The marshal arrived first, followed by two townsmen Jesse barely recognized. They dismounted slow, hands resting on holsters but not drawing yet. Jesse kept his stance wide, steady, every nerve wound tight beneath his skin. "I hear you killed a man in your own kitchen," the marshal said, squinting up at him. Jesse nodded. "Didn't give me much choice." The marshal sighed like a man already tired of the day. "Town spooked. General store's still ash. You're still wanted on paper from Cheyenne, and now you've added a fresh corpse to your troubles." Jesse opened his mouth to answer, but Clara stepped forward first. Her voice cut through the cold air like a blade. "That man broke into my home," she said, "with a loaded gun. Jesse saved my life. Saved the boys, too." The marshal studied her for a long, heavy moment. The other men shifted uncomfortably, boots scuffing against frozen dirt. "Paperwork says you're trouble," the marshal said at last. "But what I see right now is a man standing still, defending what's his." Jesse held the marshal's gaze. "I'm not running," he said again, low and final. The marshal gave a tired nod. "Then you better be ready to stay." And with that, he turned and rode off, kicking dust behind him. Jesse stood there long after they disappeared from view. For the first time, the weight in his chest didn't feel like punishment. It felt like a decision. Winter deepened its hold on Redemption Hollow. Snow climbed the porch steps like a slow, creeping tide. Icicles hung thick along the eaves, catching morning light like glass knives. The air held a stillness Jesse hadn't known in years. Not peace exactly, but something close. A pause between storms. Inside the house, warmth fought its daily battle against the cold. The fire burned steady in the hearth. The scent of wood smoke lingered in the rafters, curling around the beams like a quiet promise that the walls would hold. Jesse moved through the small rooms with a new kind of rhythm. He chopped wood in the early light, his breath coming in heavy clouds. He mended the barn roof with clumsy but determined hands. He learned how to make porridge thick enough to feed both Clara and Luke without burning it too much. Some days were harder than others. The stairs from town hadn't stopped. Supplies came slower. Conversations ended when he entered a room. But still, he stayed. Clara stayed too. They worked in parallel. Two people who didn't speak of what they didn't need to. But in the small ways that mattered, the distance between them shrank. He caught her humming once while tending the garden bed she kept near the house, even though the soil lay frozen and bare. He found himself smiling when he heard Luke's laugh, thin and soft but growing stronger each day. One night, as a blizzard pressed hard against the windows, Jesse sat at the table sharpening a blade, watching Clara move around the kitchen with slow, practiced grace. Without looking up, she said, "You gonna stay through spring?" Her voice was quiet, but Jesse heard the question beneath it, the kind that weighed more than it sounded. He set the knife down. "If you'll have me." Clara paused, then nodded once like she'd already decided days ago. Later, as the wind howled and the fire dimmed, Jesse carried Luke to bed, tucking the boy beneath quilts stitched with years of wear and worry. He stood there longer than necessary, listening to the child's even breathing. When he turned back, Clara stood in the doorway watching him. Their eyes met, not with promises, not with grand declarations, but with something steadier, an understanding, a quiet, hard-earned trust. And maybe, buried under layers of loss and stubborn pride, the fragile start of something new. Jesse crossed the room, pausing beside her. He didn't touch her, not yet, but he stood close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed. "Thank you," he said, voice low, "for everything." Clara's smile was small, tired, but real. "Don't thank me," she whispered. "Not yet." Then she turned off the lamp, leaving them both in the hush of firelight and winter dark, where the walls stood strong and the past, for just this night, stayed quiet. And in that soft, golden glow, against all odds, Jesse McCall felt like a man with a home again,